There is a face in a Cairo museum that has been dead for more than 3,000 years. The skin has pulled tight against the bone. The linen wrappings are frayed at the edges and dark with the particular discoloration of antiquity. The eyes are gone, collapsed inward under the pressure of time. But if you look closely at the cheeks, at the preserved tissue across the forehead and around the nose, you can see something patterned. Small, raised, pocked impressions distributed in clusters across the surface of skin that belonged to a man who ruled an empire. That man was Ramses the Fifth.
He died around 1145 years before the Common Era, or more precisely, around 1157, though ancient chronology carries margins of error that ancient kings would have found undignified. He was Pharaoh of Egypt during the 20th dynasty. He commanded armies, oversaw construction of monuments, held dominion over the Nile Delta and the agricultural civilizations that depended on its annual flooding. His name was inscribed in cartouche across temple walls in the distinctive oval border that marked royal identity.
His body was wrapped and preserved with extraordinary care, as all pharaohs were, because the Egyptians believed the body had to last, that the physical vessel was necessary for whatever came after death, in the fields of Aru, or wherever the blessed dead were believed to go. It lasted, and what lasted with it were the lesions. Modern analysis of the mummified remains of Ramses the Fifth has produced what historians and epidemiologists now describe as the earliest physical evidence of smallpox infection in any human body ever recovered. The pocked scarring on his face is consistent with the pustular rash that defines the disease, the telltale pattern of raised vesicles that appear across the skin, rupture, dry, and leave behind craters that remain for a lifetime. Or in this case, for 3,000 years. He may not have died of it. The historical record is incomplete, but those marks were there when he died, or had been there before, and they were preserved by the same embalming process designed to preserve him. What that means is this: at least as far back as 3,000 years ago, variola major, the virus we now call smallpox, was already living in human populations, already carving its signature into human faces, already moving through cities and courts and armies in the ancient world. Variola major is not a complicated thing, biologically speaking. It is a large DNA virus, one of the largest known to infect humans, substantially bigger than most viruses that have marked human history. It belongs to a genus called orthopox virus, which also includes cowpox and monkeypox and a handful of other related pathogens. Unlike many of the diseases that have devastated human populations, plague, cholera, influenza, smallpox has no animal reservoir. It does not hide in rodents between epidemics. It does not lurk in bats or birds or livestock, waiting for a favorable opportunity to cross the species barrier. It lives in exactly one host, human beings. That is, in some ways, a weakness. A virus with only one host is dependent on that host in a way that viruses with multiple reservoirs are not. In theory, it is a vulnerability that could be exploited.
But in the way history actually unfolded across 3,000 years, it functioned as something closer to a trap. Because a virus that can only survive in human populations must keep moving through them. It must constantly find new hosts. And in the ancient world, That meant it thrived precisely where human beings were gathering in unprecedented numbers. In markets, in cities, in river valleys where agricultural civilizations had compressed tens of thousands of bodies into close contact for the first time in the history of our species. The Indian subcontinent has ancient Sanskrit texts from roughly 1500 years before the Common Era that describe a disease consistent with smallpox, pustular eruptions on the skin, high fever, swelling of the limbs, eruptions that scab and scar.
A goddess named Sitala was worshipped specifically in connection with the pox, simultaneously associated with the disease, and invoked for protection from it. The relationship between the divine and the epidemiological was not a contradiction to ancient minds. It was simply recognition that this thing, whatever it was beyond ordinary human control, and extraordinary forces had to be petitioned if you wanted to survive it. The Chinese physician Ji Hong, writing around 320 years into the Common Era, described what he called a seasonal epidemic disorder marked by head and body sores that looked like burning fire. He offered remedies. He described the progression of the illness with enough clinical precision that generations of medical historians have read it as smallpox.
He was working roughly 1,200 years after whoever gave the disease to Ramses the Fifth, which tells you something about the depth of this pathogen's relationship with human civilization. It is not a relationship that began with recorded history. It is a relationship that recorded history found already underway. The statistics, when you say them plainly, are almost impossible to absorb. Roughly 30% of people infected with variola major died. Of those who survived, approximately 30% suffered permanent blindness, caused by the lesions that formed on the surface of the cornea during the acute phase of the illness. Nearly all survivors, nearly every person who encountered smallpox and came out the other side, carried visible, permanent scars for the rest of their lives.
The distinctive pitted texture that marked a smallpox survivor's face was so immediately recognizable that in many cultures it functioned as a kind of biological census record. You could look at a person and know they had been there. They had been tested. They had come through. Consider what that looks like across a civilization, across generations, across millennia of continuous exposure in a world where urban density was increasing and trade routes were extending and human populations were moving into contact with one another in new ways. Every city, large enough to sustain continuous transmission, would have a population that was perpetually cycling through the disease. Children encountering it for the first time, adults carrying immunity from childhood survival, elderly people whose faces bore the record of an encounter they had somehow survived decades before. Smallpox did not appear when civilization appeared, but it spread the way civilizations spread, along trade routes, through armies on campaign, up rivers into new valleys, across mountain passes with merchants and missionaries and refugees. It followed the movement of human ambition with a patience and a consistency that no empire has ever matched. Because no empire is immortal, and the virus did not need an empire. It needed only a body. There was never a shortage of bodies.
Kingdoms rose and built walls and established dynasties. Smallpox moved quietly through all of them. It was civilization's shadow, and it would remain so for 3,000 years.
In the summer of 430 years before the Common Era, something arrived in Athens. The Athenians were at war with Sparta. It was the second year of the Peloponnesian War, and the Athenian strategy under the statesman Pericles was to shelter behind the city's famous long walls. avoid direct land engagement, where the Spartans held an advantage, and rely on Athenian naval superiority and financial resources to outlast the Spartan coalition. It was a strategically sound approach. It also meant that enormous numbers of people from the surrounding Attic countryside had been brought inside the city walls for protection. The population density inside Athens increased dramatically. And then, the disease arrived. The historian Thucydides survived it.
He documented what happened with a clinical precision that was unusual for his era and remains remarkable 2,500 years later. He described people in apparently good health who were suddenly seized by violent heats in the head, redness and inflammation in the eyes, bleeding in the throat and tongue. He described sneezing, hoarseness, violent coughing, vomiting. He described the skin breaking out in pustules and ulcers. He described people who could not bear the touch of even the lightest clothing against their bodies because of the sensitivity of the inflamed skin. He described patients who threw themselves into wells in an attempt to relieve the burning fever. He described it killing in enormous numbers, possibly a quarter of the Athenian military forces, by some estimates.
Larger fractions of the civilian population sheltering inside the walls. He described the disease as having originated somewhere in Africa, traveling through Ethiopia and Egypt and Persia, arriving in Athens by ship through the port of Piraeus. What he did not describe, because he had no vocabulary for it, because no one in 430 had the conceptual framework to describe it, was the specific pathogen. Scholars have debated the identity of the plague of Athens for more than 2 millennia. Typhus has been proposed. Typhoid fever has been proposed. Bubonic plague, measles, Ebola, and a half-dozen other candidates have been offered and contested by historians and epidemiologists over the centuries.
In 2005, DNA analysis of dental pulp from a mass grave in Athens, dating to the period, produced evidence that some researchers read as consistent with typhoid fever, Salmonella typhi. But the molecular evidence is incomplete. The sample size is small, and not all researchers accept the conclusion. Smallpox is among the candidates that some historians have proposed, based on the skin symptoms Thucydides describes. But the molecular evidence needed to confirm it is not there. This must be said clearly. We do not know with certainty what killed Athens in 430. The historical record is suggestive and genuinely inconclusive. Anyone who tells you otherwise is choosing narrative over evidence.
What matters for this story is not which specific pathogen ended the Athenian Golden Age. What matters is what the plague revealed about the nature of power in the ancient world. That a city, however powerful, however magnificent in its architecture and its philosophy and its democratic ideals and its naval dominance, could be brought to its knees by something invisible. That the elaborate strategic calculations of the most sophisticated political minds in the ancient world were simply irrelevant when the enemy was not Sparta, but biology. Pericles himself died in 429.
The ancient sources suggest it was a lingering illness consistent with the plague, what Plutarch calls a slow and gentle wasting that eventually extinguished him without the violent crisis that had killed so many others. Athens never fully recovered the strategic confidence and political cohesion it had possessed before the epidemic. The war continued for another generation, but the Athens that emerged from the plague years was diminished in ways that military victories could not restore. Centuries passed. Empires rose. and the pattern repeated. In the year 165, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, legions returning from campaigns against the Parthians in the eastern provinces brought something home with them.
The Roman physician Galen documented the outbreak that followed with enough clinical detail that later historians could attempt diagnosis across 17 centuries. The epidemic is now known as the Antonine Plague, named for the Antonine dynasty that included Marcus Aurelius. It lasted until approximately 180, the year Marcus Aurelius died, and during that 15-year span, it killed between 5 million and 9 million people across the Roman Empire by conservative estimates, with some regions experiencing mortality rates that devastated the local capacity to maintain agricultural production, military recruitment, and civic administration simultaneously.
The Fountainine Plague is a separate event from the Plague of Cyprian, which came roughly 70 years later, from 251 to approximately 262, and which struck the Roman Empire during a period of intense political fragmentation and external military pressure. These two catastrophes are frequently conflated in popular accounts of Roman decline, but they are distinct episodes, separated by more than 2 generations, each with its own arc of devastation and its own contribution to the slow erosion of Roman institutional capacity. Confusing them is a common error, and it matters, because the cumulative effect of both, 2 separate waves of catastrophic epidemic disease, each lasting years, each killing millions, is more significant than either one alone. The Antonine Plague, based on Galen's clinical descriptions, has a stronger case for being smallpox than most other historical epidemic candidates. The skin manifestations he describes, the fever progression, the widespread mortality, these are consistent with what variola major does to an immunologically naive population. But certainty remains out of reach. The ancient world did not leave us tissue samples. What it left us is the evidence of consequence. Armies thinned, tax revenues collapsed, provincial governance became unreliable. The intellectual confidence of Rome, its certainty that it had mastered the world through law and military force and administrative efficiency, absorbed wounds from which,
by the time Europe entered the medieval period, smallpox had become something the historical sources barely bothered to document, except in years of exceptional mortality. It had become background noise, a permanent feature of urban life, particularly in cities large enough to sustain continuous transmission. London, Paris, Constantinople, Cairo. Generation after generation, the disease cycled through. Children encountered it first. Those who survived carried immunity. Those who did not survive were buried. It killed without distinction of rank or wealth or piety. In 1774, Louis XV of France, one of the most powerful monarchs in the Western world, surrounded by the most sophisticated medical establishment money could purchase, died of smallpox at the age of 63.
His court, terrified of contagion, abandoned him during his final days. His body was sealed in a lead-lined coffin, without the usual funeral ceremonies, because the risk of exposure was considered too high. The death rates in medieval European populations during smallpox outbreaks ran at approximately 30 to 40% of those infected. In dense urban environments, in years when the susceptible pool had grown large enough to sustain a major outbreak, the toll could be catastrophic for individual communities. Children were disproportionately represented among the dead, because adults who had survived previous exposure carried partial immunity while children had not yet encountered the pathogen. And so, in many European cities, smallpox settled into a grim rhythm.
The virus moved through the youngest members of the population most visibly and most lethally. Those who survived childhood exposure carried immunity into adulthood. Those who did not were simply gone, their absence creating the very immunological gap that made the next generation of children equally vulnerable. Empires rose, dynasties fell, philosophies were born and discarded. The smallpox virus noticed none of it. It simply moved from one warm body to the next, as it had been doing since before the death of Ramesses, as it would continue to do for many centuries more. Indifferent to human ambition. Patient in the way that only things without consciousness can be patient. Perfectly, inexhaustibly patient.
In the year 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of what is now Mexico with approximately 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a collection of artillery and edged weapons that the inhabitants of the continent had never encountered. He also brought something he did not know he was carrying. The indigenous populations of the Americas, the Aztec Empire in central Mexico, the Maya in the Yucatan and highlands of Guatemala, the Inca Empire stretching along the spine of South America, and the hundreds of smaller nations and confederations that populated a continent of extraordinary cultural and environmental diversity, had been isolated from the Old World for at least 12,000 years, possibly longer.
During that isolation, they had developed complex civilizations, sophisticated agricultural systems, astronomical knowledge of considerable precision, legal codes, and trade networks that spanned thousands of miles across 2 continents. They had domesticated crops that would eventually feed the world: maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, squash. They had built cities and ceremonial centers of considerable scale and engineering complexity. What they had not developed, because there was no mechanism by which they could have developed it, was immunity to the suite of infectious diseases that had been circulating through Old World populations for millennia. They had not been exposed to measles, to typhus, to influenza, to plague. They had not been exposed to smallpox. And because they had not been exposed to it, no one in their populations carried the antibodies that come from survival, or the partial resistance that comes from generations of exposure in a lineage. They were, in the clinical language of epidemiology, immunologically naive, completely susceptible. In 1520, a member of a Spanish expedition arriving from Cuba carried an active smallpox infection onto the coast of Mexico.
A place of canals and floating gardens, and monumental architecture and dense, interlocking neighborhoods where families lived in close proximity. In a population with no prior exposure and no acquired immunity whatsoever, smallpox did not behave the way it behaved in medieval Europe. In Europe,
A significant portion of the adult population had survived childhood infection and carried immune memory. There was a break on transmission, imperfect but real. In Tenochtitlan, there was no break. There was no reservoir of immunity. There were only people who had never encountered this pathogen and whose immune systems had no history with it.
The disease moved through the city as fire moves through dry grass in a summer wind, without resistance, without anything to slow it, until it had reached everyone it could reach. The Aztec emperor at the time of the initial outbreak was Cuitlahuac. He had ascended following the death of Moctezuma II, a complicated succession that occurred during the period of Spanish military presence in the city. Cuitlahuac was not a passive or ineffective ruler. He organized armed resistance to Cortés with considerable success.
He was responsible for the catastrophic Spanish defeat on the night called La Noche Triste, the Night of Tears, in the summer of 1520, when the Aztecs drove the Spanish forces from Tenochtitlan with enormous losses, killing hundreds of soldiers and forcing Cortés to retreat and rebuild his forces over the following months. Cuitlahuac died approximately 80 days after becoming emperor of smallpox. He was succeeded by Cuauhtémoc, who led the Aztec defense through the siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521. By that point, the military capacity of the empire, its ability to field armies, maintain supply lines, coordinate strategic defense, had been shattered, not primarily by Spanish military force, by the epidemic that had moved through the city over the preceding year.
The soldiers who should have defended the causeways were dead or incapacitated. The commanders who should have directed them had been reduced in number. The administrative infrastructure that should have coordinated the defense was functioning at a fraction of its former capacity. Cortés did not conquer the Aztec Empire with 500 men. The disease had already done the essential work. He arrived to collect the ruins. The pattern repeated itself across the continent, with variations that were local but consequences that were structurally similar. Historical analysis of the available evidence suggests that epidemic disease, almost certainly including smallpox, possibly also other Old World pathogens, reached the Inca Empire in what is now Peru by approximately 1527, years before any Spanish soldier arrived.
The Inca Emperor Huayna Capac died around that time in circumstances that many historians read as consistent with epidemic disease, most likely including smallpox. His death was not simply the death of a ruler. It triggered a succession crisis of the First Order. His sons Huáscar and Atahualpa went to war for control of the empire, dividing the Inca military and administrative apparatus precisely at the moment when cohesion would have been most valuable. When Francisco Pizarro arrived on the Pacific coast of South America in 1532 with fewer than 200 men, he encountered an empire that had already been catastrophically weakened by epidemic disease, by civil war, by the collapse of centralized authority that followed the death of Huayna Capac.
The military feat Pizarro accomplished was real. His capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca, where a few dozen horsemen and infantry faced thousands of Inca troops, was extraordinary in its audacity and its violence. But it was accomplished on ground that smallpox had prepared years in advance. The demographic consequences across the Americas unfolded over decades. Estimates of pre-Columbian population are contested. The historical methodology is genuinely difficult, and the numbers vary significantly depending on the methods used. But the direction of change is not contested. Indigenous populations across the Americas experienced catastrophic decline in the generations following European contact with epidemic disease.
primarily, but not exclusively smallpox, among the principal agents of that decline. Communities that had numbered in the tens of thousands shrank to hundreds.
Languages died because there were no longer enough speakers. Agricultural knowledge accumulated across centuries was lost because there were no longer enough people alive to pass it on. Political structures that had governed complex civilizations collapsed not because they were structurally inferior, but because the people who maintained them were dead. The most effective tool in the conquest of the Americas was not a sword. It was not a horse or a cannon or the steel armor that made Spanish soldiers more resilient in close combat than their indigenous counterparts. The most effective tool was invisible. It had no name in any European language at the time that accurately described what it was. It traveled through breath and contact and the ordinary proximity of people living near each other. It arrived on the continent because humans had crossed an ocean and carried it with them, inadvertently, without understanding what they were doing. The virus had no strategy and no loyalty and no awareness of what it was accomplishing. It simply did what it had always done. It found a new population and moved through it. In the old world, that process had taken millennia. 3,000 years of epidemic attrition that left survivors with partial immunity and civilizations that had been shaped by the presence of the disease over time. In the Americas, the same process compressed into a single catastrophic century, and the result was not merely the death of individuals. It was the erasure of civilizations. What happened in the Americas changed the scale of smallpox's historical footprint permanently. It took a disease that had been devastating but survivable, chronic, terrible, always present but never quite sufficient to destroy a civilization that had time to adapt, and demonstrated what it could do when it encountered a population with no defenses at all. That demonstration was noticed. And in the century that followed, someone decided to apply the lesson deliberately.
In the summer of 1763, the British military situation in the interior of North America was precarious in a way that the generals in London found genuinely alarming. The 7 Years' War had formally ended that February with the Treaty of Paris, transferring French territorial claims in North America to British control. On paper, Britain was now the dominant colonial power on the continent east of the Mississippi. On the ground, the reality was considerably more complicated.
Indigenous nations who had allied with France, or who had simply maintained a precarious equilibrium with French colonists who had generally preferred trade to territorial seizure, now found themselves confronting a British colonial administration with different assumptions, different ambitions, and less interest in the diplomatic relationships that French traders had cultivated over generations. The result was a broad coalition uprising that British historians named Pontiac's Rebellion, after the Ottawa leader Pontiac, who was among its most prominent organizing figures. Indigenous forces attacked British forts and settlements across a wide front, stretching from the Great Lakes region down through the Ohio Valley and into Pennsylvania. Fort Detroit came under siege. Smaller British outposts fell in rapid succession. British settlers in Pennsylvania and Virginia fled toward the coast.
The British military command, which had assumed that the end of the war with France meant the pacification of the interior, found itself confronting a sustained, coordinated resistance that its existing forces were struggling to contain. At Fort Pitt, positioned at the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers, on the site where Pittsburgh now stands, The British garrison under Captain Simeon Ecuyer had been under siege since late May by Delaware and Shawnee forces. Inside the fort, there was active smallpox. Soldiers and civilians sheltering behind the walls were sick. The disease had arrived inside the fortification and was working its way through the population confined there. On the 24th of June, 1763, 2 Delaware leaders came to Fort Pitt under a flag of truce.
Their names were Turtle's Heart and Mamalty. They urged the British garrison to abandon the fort and leave the region. The meeting followed the diplomatic forms of the time. There was an exchange of speeches, a negotiation of positions, and a formal exchange of gifts, as was customary in diplomatic encounters between British colonial authorities and indigenous nations. The British gave them blankets, 2 blankets and a handkerchief. These were not ordinary gifts selected from the fort's general stores. They had been taken from the smallpox ward inside the fortification. This is documented. It is not inference or interpretation or retrospective accusation. Captain Ecuyer noted the exchange in the official fort journal.
William Trent, a trader and militia commander present at Fort Pitt, recorded in his own contemporaneous account the following: "We gave them 2 blankets and an handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect." The phrase, "the desired effect," requires no interpretation. The intent was to transmit smallpox to the Delaware through contaminated materials. The intent was clearly stated, in writing. At the time, the same concept appears independently in the correspondence between General Jeffrey Amherst, the British Commander-in-Chief for North America, the officer whose name is now attached to this episode in most historical accounts, and Colonel Henry Bouquet, who was leading a relief column toward Fort Pitt from the east.
In a letter dated late June 1763, Amherst explicitly asked Bouquet whether it might be possible to transmit smallpox among the indigenous nations involved in the uprising using infected blankets. Bouquet replied that he would attempt it. Amherst endorsed the plan. These letters have been examined by historians, analyzed in academic journals, discussed in court proceedings related to colonial legal history, and reproduced in major scholarly works on the history of biological warfare and North American colonialism. They are not disputed as documents. Whether's disputed is what happened next. Whether the Fort Pitt blankets actually transmitted smallpox to the Delaware and
The stability of variola major on dry surfaces at ambient summer temperatures is genuinely uncertain. The virus can survive outside a host for some period of time, but estimates of how long vary, and the conditions inside a worn wool blanket in a humid Ohio summer are not ideal for preservation. Whether infection could be transmitted in this way, reliably enough to cause an epidemic, is contested among virologists and historians alike. There was a smallpox epidemic among Ohio Valley indigenous nations in 1763 and 1764. The Delaware were affected.
Whether the Fort Pitt blankets caused it, contributed to it, or were simply coincident with an outbreak that would have occurred through other routes regardless,
This is where the historical debate sits, and where it has sat for decades. Some scholars argue the epidemic was already underway through other transmission routes before the blanket exchange occurred. Others argue the blankets were likely causative. The honest assessment is that the causal chain cannot be established with certainty from this temporal distance with the evidence that survives. But the intent does not require causal proof to be morally and historically significant. Trent's words are plain. Amherst's words are plain.
The desire to weaponize a disease, to take something that had been destroying populations across the world for 3,000 years and aim it deliberately at a specific group of human beings for a military and political purpose. That desire was clearly expressed, carefully considered, and deliberately acted upon in the summer of 1763. This is what Fort Pitt represents in the history of smallpox. Not merely another outbreak. Not merely another instance of the virus doing what it had always done. Fort Pitt represents the moment, at least in the surviving documented record, when human beings took the ancient killer and tried to make it a tool, an instrument, a policy, something to be aimed, like a weapon, at a chosen target.
The disease that had destroyed the Aztec Empire without any Spanish soldier planning it or understanding it, that had swept through Tenochtitlan as an unintended consequence of human movement, was now being deliberately considered as a means of military and political coercion by British officers writing letters to each other about the logistics of its deployment. The virus itself was unchanged. The human relationship to it had transformed entirely. For 3,000 years, smallpox had been something that happened to people, something they fled from and prayed against, something they watched kill their children and built goddesses around and consulted physicians about and buried their kings from.
It was terrible, and it was everywhere. And it was, in every account, across every culture, presented as a force beyond human control. Something to be endured, survived if possible, mourned when not. In 1763, a British general sitting in an office far from the Ohio Valley tried to turn that force into a weapon. He may not have succeeded. The epidemiological evidence for effectiveness is ambiguous, but the attempt tells us something about what smallpox had become in the human imagination by the 18th century. It tells us that its power was understood, even if its mechanism was not.
That its capacity to destroy populations was recognized as a military asset by people who were willing to exploit that capacity against enemies they considered to be beyond the protections normally afforded to combatants. The Fort Pitt episode is early in the history of biological warfare. It is not the last. But in the history of smallpox specifically, it marks a threshold, the moment when the relationship between humanity and this particular virus shifted from purely passive to deliberately active, from victim to would-be perpetrator. It is a grim threshold. It was crossed by people who knew what they were doing and did it anyway.
And it happened 314 years before the World Health Organization would declare, in a moment of extraordinary collective achievement, that smallpox had been eradicated from the human species entirely. Between the threshold of Fort Pitt and the declaration of eradication, a great deal had to happen. Discoveries had to be made. Resistances had to be overcome. Campaigns had to be fought, not with blankets, but with vaccines and field teams and political negotiation in some of the most inaccessible and conflict-ridden places on Earth. But in 1763, none of that had happened yet. There was no vaccine.
There was only the disease, moving through populations as it had always moved, and now, in the hands of a few men who thought they could direct it, the terrible possibility of something worse than a natural epidemic, something intentional. For thousands of years, there was no defense. And then, on a dairy farm in Gloucestershire, a milkmaid mentioned something curious to a young country doctor.
For thousands of years, there was no defense. And then, on a dairy farm in Gloucestershire, a milkmaid mentioned something curious to a young country doctor. But the story of how humanity learned to fight back does not begin in England. It does not begin in the 18th century. It does not begin with a doctor, or a laboratory, or a royal commission, or any of the institutions we have come to associate with medical progress. It begins, as so many things do, with someone watching carefully. Someone who had seen enough death to understand that survival was not random. Someone who noticed a pattern in the wreckage that the disease left behind and refused to accept that the pattern was meaningless.
In China, perhaps as early as the 10th century, physicians began to notice something that any careful observer in an endemic region eventually noticed. People who had survived a mild case of smallpox did not get it again. They could walk through an outbreak. They could nurse the sick. They could live in households where the disease was killing everyone else. And they remained untouched. That observation was not new. It was ancient. The Greek historian Thucydides had noted it during the plague of Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era, when he wrote that those who had recovered from the disease could attend the sick without fear. But for centuries, that observation remained just an observation, a thing that was known without being acted upon.
Chinese practitioners took the next step. They asked what everyone who had made that observation had failed to ask, or had asked but not answered. They asked, what if you could give someone a mild case on purpose? What if the key was not waiting for the disease to arrive on its own terms, in its own ferocity, but in engineering an encounter on your terms, on terms you could control? The technique they developed was called variolation. In Chinese, the practice was known as zhongdu, planting the pox. The name itself carries the agricultural logic of the intervention. You plant something small, something you have selected, something you have measured.
And then you tend it, and it grows in the way you have shaped it to grow, not in the way the wild variety grows when it arrives without invitation. In its earliest documented form, practitioners would take the dried crusts from the pustules of a smallpox patient who had survived a relatively mild infection. They would grind those crusts into a fine powder, and then, using a small silver tube, they would blow that powder into the nostril of a healthy person. One nostril for a boy, the other for a girl. The asymmetry was ritual, not medical. But the underlying act was medicine, even if no one would have called it that in any vocabulary we recognize. There were variations in technique, because there are always variations in technique when something is practiced across a large country over many generations. Some practitioners extracted the fluid from an active pustule rather than using dried crust. They would make a small incision in the skin of the arm, introduce the fluid directly, and bind the wound. This was closer to what the Ottomans would later practice independently, and closer still to what Jenner would eventually understand. Other variations were more deliberate in their selection criteria.
Practitioners understood, or believed they understood, that material taken from patients with the mildest possible disease produced milder reactions.
Material that had been stored for weeks, or that had passed through several intermediary patients, seemed less dangerous than freshly extracted matter from a severe case. The logic was empirical and careful. They were selecting for virulence without any concept of what virulence was. They were attenuating a pathogen without any concept of what a pathogen was. They were practicing a kind of intuitive microbiology in the complete absence of microscopes. There is something worth dwelling on here. The people who developed variolation did not have germ theory. They did not have any model of infectious disease that would have been recognizable to a 19th century scientist.
They believed in principles of balance and imbalance, in the flow of qi, in ideas about constitution and susceptibility that belonged to a completely different framework of understanding the body. And yet they were right. Not right about the why, not right about the mechanism, not right about any of the explanations they might have offered, but right about the what, right that it worked, right that the specific, selected, controlled exposure produced something protective, right that the protection was real and lasting. This happens more often in the history of medicine than we tend to acknowledge. Correct practices that rest on incorrect theories. Interventions that work for reasons their practitioners do not understand and could not have understood.
The gap between efficacy and explanation is wider than we like to think, and the history of medicine is full of people on the right side of that gap, standing in the dark, unable to see why they were right, doing the right thing anyway. The Emperor Kangxi, who ruled China from 1661 to 1722, had personal reason to take variolation seriously. He had survived smallpox himself as a child during an epidemic in 1661, the same year his father, the Shunji Emperor, died. Some historians believe from the same disease. The smallpox had left its marks on Kangxi's face. It had also, in the dynastic arithmetic of the time, shaped his path to the throne.
His grandmother, the Grand Empress Dowager Sha Zhuang, had played a role in his selection as emperor, partly on the grounds that he had already survived the disease that was still threatening his siblings. A child emperor chosen partly because of his immunity to smallpox. Then a grown emperor who used that immunity as a starting point for thinking about how to protect others. Around 1681, Kangxi began actively promoting variolation. He had members of his own household inoculated. He had the technique extended to the armies stationed on the northern frontier, where smallpox moved easily through military encampments filled with men who had grown up in regions where the disease was less common. He brought practitioners to court. He asked questions. He demanded reports on outcomes.
A 17th century Chinese emperor personally directing a mass inoculation program for his military. Sit with that for a moment. In Europe, at the same period, responses to smallpox remained what they had been for centuries. Quarantine where possible. Prayer. Fumigation of rooms with sulfur and aromatic herbs. Herbal preparations of dubious value. The bleeding and purging of patients that the humoral tradition prescribed, which almost certainly made things worse. And waiting. Waiting to see who would survive, who would be blinded, whose face would be destroyed, whose lungs would fill. The knowledge.
The world was not yet connected in the way that would allow a technique practiced in Beijing to reach London. Trade routes existed. Missionaries traveled. Merchants exchanged goods. But medical knowledge moved slowly, and it moved along pathways shaped by who was considered credible, whose observations were deemed worthy of transmission, whose practices were worth recording. The breakthrough came through an intermediary that no one could have predicted. It came through the Ottoman Empire, and it came, specifically, through a woman who had no formal medical training, no institutional affiliation, no claim to scientific authority, and who changed the course of European medicine anyway. Her name was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu.
She was the wife of Edward Wortley Montagu, who was appointed British ambassador to the Ottoman court in 1716. She was also a writer, brilliant, sharp, irreverent, the author of letters that her contemporaries recognized as extraordinary documents, and that historians have since recognized as primary sources of the first importance. And she was a survivor. In 1715, a smallpox epidemic had moved through England. Her brother Charles, 20 years old and recently married, contracted the disease and died within days. Lady Mary herself was infected. She survived, but the disease destroyed the eyelashes above her eyes and left her face permanently marked. She was 26 years old. She had been considered one of the great beauties of London society.
She would spend the rest of her life in a face that carried what the disease had done. When she arrived in Constantinople in 1717, she found a city that handled smallpox differently. Each autumn, she wrote, a group of old women, she called them engrafters, moved through the city offering a procedure to the families who wanted it. They carried with them a nutshell, filled with matter taken from the mildest smallpox cases of the season. The technique was this. They would search out a vein in the arm of the person to be inoculated, make a small puncture with a large needle, introduce a small amount of the smallpox matter directly into the vein, and bind the wound with a piece of shell.
The person inoculated would spend the next 8 or 10 days with a mild fever, a limited number of pustules, never more than 20 or 30, she wrote, and then recover. And they would not get smallpox again. Lady Mary watched this being done. She spoke with the practitioners. She spoke with families who had done it, and families who had not. She sat with the arithmetic of what she was seeing. On one side, the old woman with her nutshell and her needle. On the other, her brother's grave and the face she saw in her mirror. She wrote about it in a letter to her friend Sarah Chiswell in April 1717.
The letter is precise, curious, vivid, and entirely without the hedging that a person of less confidence might have employed. She described the procedure in detail. She described the outcomes she had observed. She described the social geography of who in Constantinople was doing it and who was not. She was not writing a medical treatise. She was writing a letter that happened to contain one of the most important public health observations in the history of English medicine. In April 1718, she had her son variolated. He was 5 years old. The procedure was performed by the embassy surgeon, Charles Maitland, with the assistance of an old Greek woman who was experienced in the Ottoman technique. The boy developed the expected mild illness and recovered. She returned to England in 1721 during a smallpox epidemic. She immediately had her daughter variolated. She lobbied. She argued. She brought Maitland to demonstrate the technique to London physicians. She called in social debts. She used every tool that an aristocratic woman in 18th century England had available. The medical establishment was deeply skeptical. The skepticism was not entirely unreasonable. The procedure introduced material from a sick person into a healthy one. That violated every instinct and every theoretical framework that English physicians had been trained in. It also, as critics quickly noted, carried real and undeniable risk. Roughly 1 in 50 people who were variolated died from the procedure.
More would die in a natural epidemic, perhaps 30 times more proportionally. But those deaths were distributed across the population randomly, falling on people who had no choice in the matter. The deaths from variolation fell on people who had chosen to undergo the procedure. That difference between a natural risk and an iatrogenic one felt morally significant to a lot of people. It still does. The British royal family wanted their children protected. Before any royal child would be inoculated, the Crown insisted on trials. In August 1721, 6 condemned prisoners in Newgate Prison were offered the following bargain. Submit to inoculation, and if you survive, you will be pardoned. All 6 agreed. All 6 were inoculated by Charles Maitland, with royal physicians observing. All 6 survived. The trial then moved to children at a charity school in London. 11 children were variolated. All 11 survived. Some were subsequently exposed to smallpox patients to test their immunity. None developed the disease. In April 1722, 2 of the royal grandchildren, the daughters of the Prince of Wales, were inoculated. They survived without significant illness. The practice spread. Slowly, unevenly, meeting resistance at every level. Clergy objected. Some physicians objected. Lay people objected. There were pamphlets and public debates and letters in newspapers. There were cases, genuine cases, where things went wrong, where the inoculation itself sparked a severe infection, where the inoculated person transmitted smallpox to others in their household. But it worked.
Where it was widely practiced, where communities committed to it and maintained it, smallpox mortality declined in ways that could not be explained by chance. The logic of deliberately controlled exposure, the logic that Chinese practitioners had worked out centuries before, was being confirmed case by case, community by community, in the bodies of people who survived. Medical progress often begins at a great distance from the place where it is eventually recognized. The knowledge that allowed Lady Mary Wortley Montagu to protect her children originated in China, traveled through the Ottoman Empire, arrived in England through the observations of a woman with no medical credentials who had a very personal reason to pay attention. That path is not unusual.
It is, if you look carefully at the history of medicine, a more common path than the one that moves cleanly from discovery to institution to adoption. The straight line is the exception. The wandering road through unexpected intermediaries, through people who had no right to be carrying the knowledge they carried, is closer to the rule.
The milkmaid's name was Sarah Nelmes. She was a young woman who worked on a farm in the Gloucestershire countryside in the west of England in the spring of 1796. She had a rash on her hand. Not a severe rash, not a frightening rash. The kind of rash that dairy workers got and mostly ignored. The rash was not smallpox. It was cowpox, a mild disease that circulated among cattle and that occasionally passed to the people who handled them closely. It caused a fever, a general feeling of illness, and a localized eruption that was unpleasant but rarely dangerous. People recovered from cowpox. They went back to work. They forgot about it. The local physician who examined Sarah Nelmes had been thinking about cowpox and about what it might mean for nearly 20 years. His name was Edward Jenner. He was 46 years old, a country doctor in the Gloucestershire village of Berkeley, trained in London under the great surgeon and experimentalist John Hunter. Hunter had given him a principle he never forgot. Don't think. Hunter had written to him in a letter decades earlier, when Jenner was still young. Try the experiment. The observation that Jenner had been turning over was not original to him. It was a piece of local folklore, repeated among dairy workers and farm families in the Gloucestershire countryside. Dairymaids did not get smallpox.
More precisely, dairymaids who had contracted cowpox, who had gone through the mild occupational illness that was a hazard of their work, seemed to be immune to the far more dangerous disease that periodically swept through the surrounding population. Jenner had first heard this as an apprentice physician. A young woman had told him, matter-of-factly and without any sense, that she was saying something remarkable, that she could not take smallpox. She had had the cowpox, she said. He did not dismiss her. He was not the kind of person who dismissed things. He was the kind of person who filed things away and continued thinking about them. Over the years that followed, he had been collecting
cases of dairy workers who had contracted cowpox years or decades earlier. Cases of those same people who had subsequently been exposed to smallpox, in some instances deliberately exposed through variolation attempts, and who had not developed the disease. He had a body of anecdotal evidence. He had a pattern, but a pattern is not proof. And John Hunter's advice was specific. Try the experiment. To prove that cowpox conferred protection against smallpox, Jenner needed to demonstrate it directly. He needed to take material from a cowpox lesion, introduce it into a person who had no prior exposure to either disease, allow that person to recover, and then deliberately expose them to smallpox. If the person did not develop smallpox, the hypothesis was supported.
If they did, it was not. The experiment he designed was unambiguous. It was also, by any standard of medical ethics that would be developed in the following century and a half, impossible to justify. Not because Jenner was indifferent to the welfare of the person he was experimenting on. He was not. He genuinely believed he was conferring a benefit. But the person he chose for his experiment was 8 years old, the son of his own gardener. And the boy had no capacity to give meaningful consent to what was about to happen to him. On the 14th of May, 1796, Jenner took Sarah Nelmes's hand. He extracted matter from the cowpox pustule on her palm.
He then made 2 small incisions in the arm of James Phipps, the gardener's son, and introduced the cowpox material into those cuts. He dressed the arm. He went home and waited. James Phipps developed the expected response, a mild fever, some discomfort, a small local reaction at the site of the incisions. After several days, it resolved. The boy recovered completely.
Jenner understood that a single case proved nothing in the way that a scientist needed proof. He gathered more.
Over the next 2 years, he documented additional cases of people who had contracted cowpox and who were subsequently resistant to smallpox. He documented cases of people who had received cowpox matter from him directly and who then failed to develop smallpox when challenged. He accumulated a series of case histories, each one a link in a chain. In 1798, he submitted his findings to the Royal Society of London. The Royal Society, founded in 1660 by royal charter, was the most prestigious scientific institution in Britain. It had published the work of Newton and Hooke and Boyle and Halley.
A paper accepted by the Royal Society was the highest confirmation of scientific legitimacy that the British world could offer. The Royal Society rejected the paper. The case series was too small. The evidence was not rigorous enough. The claim that a disease of cattle could prevent a disease of humans was too extraordinary to be accepted on the basis of what Jenner had presented. They advised him, in language that must have stung, not to risk his reputation by pursuing the idea further. Jenner self-published. He gathered more case histories, incorporated them into an expanded account, and had it printed at his own expense in.
The full title was a careful construction, an inquiry into the causes and effects of the variolators vaccinae, a disease discovered in some of the western counties of England, particularly Gloucestershire, and known by the name of the cowpox. He called the material he was using vaccine, from the Latin vacca, meaning cow. He called the disease it prevented variolators vaccinae, the cowpox variety of the pox diseases, a nomenclature that would within decades be extended to describe an entirely new category of medical intervention, and that would eventually name the field that grew from it: vaccines. From a cow, from a rash on a milkmaid's hand, from a piece of Gloucestershire folklore about women who worked on dairy farms.
The reception to the self-published pamphlet was mixed in the way that important ideas often are when they first appear. Some physicians read it with immediate recognition. George Pearson, a London physician, tested the method and found it worked. He began vaccinating. William Woodville, at the Smallpox and Inoculation Hospital in London, began vaccinating. Word spread through the medical community with unusual speed for the late 18th century, which had no journals capable of rapid dissemination, no internet, no mechanism for fast communication beyond the physical movement of letters and persons. Other physicians resisted. Some denied that cowpox and smallpox were related diseases at all. Some argued that the protection was temporary, that it would fade within months or years.
Some raised the religious objection that had greeted variolation a generation earlier, that introducing animal matter into a human body was unnatural, perhaps corrupting, possibly sacrilegious. Cartoonists in London produced images of vaccinated people sprouting cow horns, cow hooves, cow tails from the sites of their inoculations. The images were satirical, but they expressed a genuine anxiety about contamination, about the boundary between the human and the animal, about what it meant to use one species to protect another. The evidence did not wait for the debate to resolve. It accumulated faster than the critics could account for it. Physicians in England, France, Germany, Austria, the United States, and eventually across the colonial world reported back. The pattern held everywhere. Cowpox vaccination prevented smallpox. The protection was robust.
The safety record, while not perfect, contaminated vaccine material caused occasional harm, was incomparably better than the disease it prevented. Napoleon Bonaparte,
who was in a state of active military conflict with Britain for most of the period between 1799 and 1815, made an exception for vaccination. He ordered the entire French army vaccinated. He had hundreds of thousands of soldiers inoculated in a public health campaign conducted simultaneously with a war. When someone pointed out to him that Jenner was an Englishman and that France was at war with England, Napoleon reportedly said that nations were at war, but scientists were not. When Jenner personally petitioned Napoleon for the release of British prisoners of war, Napoleon first refused. Then he paused. Then he said, "Jenner,
I can refuse nothing to one of the greatest men in history." He released the prisoners. The Spanish crown organized an expedition that is still, in the history of public health, almost without parallel. The Royal Philanthropic Vaccine Expedition set sail from Corunna in November 1803. It was led by a Spanish physician named Francisco Xavier de Balmis. It carried 22 orphan boys. The boys were the vaccine. There was, at that time, no way to preserve cowpox material through a long sea voyage. Refrigeration did not exist. The material, if allowed to dry out, lost its potency. The solution was living transmission. Every 10 days, cowpox matter was taken from the arm of one boy and introduced into the arm of the next.
The chain of transmission moved down the line of 22 boys across the Atlantic Ocean. Each boy, infected in sequence, kept the material alive through his own body. Each boy recovered before the next was inoculated. The living chain was a vaccine storage system, warm-blooded and ambulatory, crossing the Atlantic at the pace of a sailing ship. The expedition reached Puerto Rico. It reached Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Mexico. It split, with one branch heading to the Philippines and eventually to Macau. Jenner's discovery, carried in the arms of orphan boys across 2 oceans, was introduced to populations that had had no protection against smallpox and no access to any prior immunological intervention. Jenner himself received the recognition that the Royal Society had initially denied him.
Parliament voted him £10,000 in recognition of his discovery, a sum worth several million in present terms. In 1807, they voted him another $20,000. He received honorary degrees from Oxford and Harvard, 2 institutions that had previously given him nothing. The Royal Society, which had rejected his paper, elected him a fellow. He was offered a lucrative practice in London and declined. He went home to Berkeley and continued practicing country medicine for the rest of his life. He died in January 1823, at the age of 73. He had lived to see vaccinations spreading across the world. He had lived to see Napoleon vaccinate an army. He had lived to see the Spanish expedition.
He had lived to see what had begun on his farm in Gloucestershire, moving through populations he would never visit, in countries he had never seen, in languages he could not speak. He did not live to see what it would ultimately accomplish. None of us can see that far. What Jenner had found was not understood by anyone in his time. The germ theory of disease was still 60 years away. The concept of immunity, of the body building a specific defense against a specific pathogen, would not be articulated in any rigorous form until the work of Metchnikoff and Ehrlich in the 1880s and 1890s. The word virus, in its modern biological sense, did not exist.
The thing that cowpox vaccination was doing to the immune system was completely invisible.
because the immune system itself had not yet been conceptualized. Jenner knew that it worked. He did not know why. He was like a locksmith who had made a key and tested it in the lock without knowing what mechanisms were turning inside. The key worked. He kept making copies of the key. Other people made copies of copies. And the explanation of the lock's interior mechanism, the antibodies, the T cells, the memory B cells, the entire intricate molecular architecture of immune response, came later, built on the empirical foundation that Jenner had established without being able to see any of it. James Phipps, the gardener's son, grew up in Berkeley.
He married and had children. He worked as a laborer. He lived to be 65. Jenner never forgot him, or perhaps could not forget him. He built Phipps a small cottage and kept it maintained for the man's use for the rest of Jenner's life. There was never any formal accounting between them for what had passed. What accounting would have been possible, or adequate, or even meaningful? A child's arm, a milkmaid's pustule, a country doctor who had refused to stop thinking about a piece of local folklore, and a world, slowly, imperfectly, beginning to change. The most important discoveries often arrive before their explanations.
The gap between what works and why it works is wide. And in that gap, enormous quantities of human life are either saved or lost, depending on which side of it we are standing on when the moment comes. Jenner stood on the right side. He did not know why he was on the right side. He knew only that he was, because he had tried the experiment and written down what happened and refused to be deterred by the people who told him he was wrong.
By the middle of the 19th century, vaccination against smallpox was no longer just a medical recommendation in England. It was the law. The Vaccination Act of 1853 made infant vaccination compulsory across England and Wales. Every child born after that date was required to be vaccinated against smallpox within 3 months of birth. Parents who refused faced a fine. Parents who still refused repeatedly faced imprisonment. The state had decided that the question of whether to vaccinate a child was not a purely private decision. It had consequences for everyone in the community where that child lived. It had therefore become a public matter, subject to public regulation. The government's reasoning was straightforward. Smallpox was still killing tens of thousands of people every year in England. Vaccination demonstrably reduced those deaths in communities where it was widely practiced. The logic of collective immunity, the recognition that when enough people in a community are immune, the disease cannot sustain its circulation even among those who are not, was not yet formalized in the mathematical language it would later acquire. But it was understood intuitively by the public health administrators who were watching outbreak patterns across the country. The population was not persuaded by logic alone. It never is. Opposition formed almost immediately. It came from multiple directions at once, representing not a single coordinated resistance, but a convergence of different grievances, different fears, different philosophies that happened to land on the same target. The religious objection was the oldest.
It had attended variolation in the 1720s, and it attended vaccination now. The introduction of animal matter into a human body struck many devout people as a violation of the created order. The body was made by God, in the image of God. To introduce into it material from a diseased cow was, in this view, a form of defilement. It blurred the boundary between species in a way that felt theologically intolerable. The cows in the cartoonist's satires,
the human body's sprouting bovine features after vaccination, captured something that was more than satire. They captured a genuine horror at the idea of contamination across the species line. The medical objection was more specific, and in some of its particulars, more defensible. Vaccination was not without risk.
Children had died, not many. Not in comparison to the deaths that smallpox itself would have caused, but the deaths were real and documented and named. Some of them were caused by contaminated vaccine material. The process of preparing and distributing vaccine in the mid-19th century was not standardized, was not reliably sterile, and was not consistently effective. Some batches were more dangerous than others. Critics who argued that the medical profession was systematically understating the risks of vaccination were not wrong in every particular, even if their overall conclusion, that vaccination was more dangerous than the disease, was badly wrong.
It had to do with the principle. The state had no right, the argument went, to compel a medical procedure. The body of a citizen, and certainly the body of a citizen's child, was not the government's property. Compulsory vaccination was an exercise of tyranny. It was the coercion of individuals into accepting physical interventions they had not chosen. It established a precedent, the right of the government to reach inside the family and make medical decisions, that was more dangerous than any disease. The National Anti-Vaccination League was founded in 1867, the same year that Parliament strengthened the compulsory vaccination law and made enforcement more aggressive. The timing was not coincidental. The League produced pamphlets and newsletters and lecture tours. It documented cases, genuine cases with names and dates, of children who had been harmed by vaccination. It collected testimony from parents and physicians who had seen adverse reactions. It organized public meetings. The arguments in those pamphlets are not difficult to find if you want to read them. They are not difficult to recognize either. Personal liberty versus collective protection. The right to refuse a medical intervention. The claim that official institutions are suppressing inconvenient data about harm. The argument that the medicine is worse than the disease it claims to prevent. The appeal to the sacred boundary of parental authority over a child's body. These arguments were made in 1867 England. They were made in 1905 America. They are being made somewhere today. They are, in their essential structure, the same arguments. The disease changes. The vaccine changes. The argument does not. This does not mean the argument is wrong in every particular. It does not mean that the concerns are always manufactured or always in bad faith. Institutions do sometimes suppress inconvenient data. Government health authorities have, at various points in the history of medicine, been wrong, been corrupt, been captured by commercial interests, been indifferent to the welfare of the people they claimed to protect. The problem with the anti-vaccination movements of the 19th century, and with their counterparts in every century, is not that they asked questions. Questions are appropriate. Demanding accountability from institutions is appropriate.
The problem is what happens after the questions are asked. The problem is the decision to choose from among the possible answers, the one that confirms the fear that generated the question in the first place. To look at the evidence and weight it not by what it shows, but by how it makes you feel. To define any answer that supports vaccination as compromised, and any answer that questions it as truthful. That is not skepticism. That is its opposite. In Leicester, a city in the English Midlands, an organized campaign against vaccination in the 1870s drove inoculation rates sharply down. A smallpox outbreak in 1871, before the campaign had fully taken hold, killed hundreds.
The anti-vaccination campaigners did not conclude from this that vaccination might be protective. They concluded that the outbreak was caused by the residual effects of previous vaccination campaigns, or by poor sanitation, or by factors entirely unrelated to immunization rates. The data said one thing. The campaign said another. The campaign found followers willing to believe the campaign. By the 1880s and 1890s, the political pressure was sufficient to produce a legislative compromise. Parliament introduced the concept of conscientious objection in the Vaccination Act of 1898. Parents who could demonstrate genuine, sincere objection to vaccination, not just inconvenience, not just reluctance, but conscience-based refusal, could obtain an exemption. The compromise was politically necessary and medically ambiguous.
Smallpox continued to circulate in ways it might not have if coverage had been maintained. The disease found, as it always found, the gaps. Across the Atlantic, the same tension was playing out in American courts. Henning Jacobson was a Swedish-born pastor living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was not a reckless man or an unreasonable one. As a child in Sweden, he had experienced a severe reaction to a vaccination. What kind of reaction is not precisely documented, but it had left him with a lasting conviction that the procedure was dangerous. When the Cambridge Board of Health, responding to a smallpox outbreak in 1902, ordered mandatory vaccination for all adults in the city, Jacobson refused. He was fined $5. He refused to pay.
He appealed through the Massachusetts courts, losing at each level. He brought the case to the United States Supreme Court. The case was argued in December 1904. The Supreme Court issued its decision in February 1905. Justice John Marshall Harlan, writing for a 7-2 majority, upheld the authority of the state. The liberty protected by the Constitution, Harlan wrote, was not an absolute liberty. The social compact, the foundation of organized society, rested on the recognition that individual freedoms must sometimes yield to the requirements of the common welfare. A state government acting in reasonable response to a genuine public health emergency had the authority, within constitutional limits, to compel vaccination. The $5 fine Harlan held was a reasonable exercise of that authority.
Jacobson versus Massachusetts remains the foundational American precedent on government authority in public health emergencies. It has been cited in every major debate about mandatory vaccination in the United States in the century since. It has been revisited, reinterpreted, invoked and contested. It answered a legal question. It did not settle a moral one. It never does. The moral question: who decides what happens to a body when that body's decisions affect others, has no clean resolution. It is a permanent tension. It sharpens in moments of epidemic danger and softens in periods of safety. And the softening is itself part of the problem. When smallpox was killing 30,000 people a year in England, the argument for vaccination was visceral. People had seen the disease.
They had seen what it did to a face, to lungs, to a child's eyes. The risk of the vaccine was abstract against the memory of the ward. But as vaccination worked, as the disease became rarer, as years passed without epidemics, as the generation that had seen it died and was replaced by generations that had not, the visceral argument faded, and the abstract arguments, the philosophical objections, the claims of injury and conspiracy had no competing memory to push against. The vaccine's success was the argument's undoing. The safer the world became, the less obvious the reason it had become safe. The disease you prevent is invisible. The needle is not. That asymmetry is not a failure of intelligence or of character.
It is a feature of how human attention works. We attend to what we can see. We discount what we cannot. And the public health systems that prevent epidemics are, by their nature, invisible. They are the dogs that do not bark, the epidemics that do not happen, the children who do not go blind. The anti-vaccination movements of the 19th century did not prevent the eradication of smallpox. They delayed it. They made the work harder. They cost lives that could have been saved, but they did not win. The disease was too present, too visible, too relentless in its refusal to spare anyone who was susceptible. Eventually, the accumulation of evidence was sufficient. Eventually, the institutions adapted.
Eventually, the coverage was high enough and sustained long enough to drive the circulation down, not to zero, not in England, not in the 19th century, but low enough that when a global campaign was organized a century later, the hard lessons of the Leicester outbreak and the Cambridge fine and the Newgate prison trial were available to the people who needed them. Available as evidence of what happens when coverage slips. Available as evidence of what it costs to let the argument win.
By the middle of the 20th century, smallpox had been circulating among human beings for somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years. In the 20th century alone, in the 100 years that began with Teddy Roosevelt in the White House and the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, smallpox killed an estimated 300 million people. 300 million, more than the entire population of the United States. In one century, from one disease. In 1958, a Soviet virologist named Viktor Zhdanov stood before the World Health Assembly in Minneapolis and made a proposal. He proposed that the world, every nation, every government, every health ministry on every continent, commit to the systematic, coordinated, complete global eradication of smallpox. Not reduction, not control.
Not the management of an acceptable level of endemic disease. Eradication. The total cessation of transmission everywhere on Earth. The word sounds ambitious. In 1958, it sounded nearly impossible. The context requires attention. This was 1958. The Korean War had ended 5 years earlier in stalemate. The Hungarian uprising had been crushed by Soviet tanks 2 years before. Nikita Khrushchev had recently told the West, "We will bury you." The Cold War was not an abstraction. It was the defining reality of global politics, a standoff between two nuclear-armed superpowers whose ideological conflict shaped every international negotiation, every scientific exchange, every institutional relationship across the world. Viktor Zhdanov's proposal was adopted, not because the Cold War had ended,
not because the political tensions had resolved. Not because humanity had achieved some new level of cooperative virtue, but because smallpox did not care about ideology, and both sides of the Iron Curtain understood that perfectly well. The Soviet Union had its own catastrophic history with smallpox. The disease had moved through Russian populations for centuries. A major outbreak in Moscow in 1960, after the Hum-Wocho proposal had been made, but before the eradication campaign was fully organized, killed 46 people and infected over 1,000, causing the city to be effectively locked down and more than 5 million people to be vaccinated within weeks. The Soviets had the vaccine. They had the public health infrastructure. They had in Viktor Zhdanov, a scientist who had been thinking about eradication seriously for years.
They also had a strategic calculation. A global eradication campaign would require massive international cooperation. It would require the Soviet Union to contribute vaccines, expertise, and logistical support on a scale that would bind the Western world into a framework where Soviet scientific leadership was visible and indispensable. Motivations in global health are rarely pure. The smallpox eradication campaign was built on the contributions of governments that had competing interests in almost every other domain. That it worked anyway is not a tribute to human virtue. It is a tribute to what becomes possible when enough interests align, even briefly, even partially, even in the presence of profound mutual suspicion. The World Health Organization launched the Intensified Eradication Program in January 1967.
The Director General of WHO tapped an American epidemiologist named Donald Ainsley Henderson to run it. Henderson was 38 years old. He had spent several years working on smallpox surveillance for the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. He had not applied for the position. He was in the diplomatic language of large institutions, invited with strong encouragement. He accepted. He would spend the next decade largely away from his family, moving between field offices and WHO headquarters in Geneva, managing a campaign of a scale and complexity that had no historical precedent. In 1967, smallpox was still endemic in 31 countries. The disease was circulating in sub-Saharan Africa. It was circulating across the Indian subcontinent. It was circulating in Brazil, the last remaining country in the Americas where it had not been eliminated. The initial WHO strategy was mass vaccination. The plan was to vaccinate 80% of the population in each endemic country within 4 to 5 years. The mathematics of herd immunity, applied to smallpox's particular transmission characteristics, suggested that 80% coverage would be sufficient to interrupt transmission. The mathematics were sound. The logistics were not. Sub-Saharan Africa had infrastructure that had been systematically underdeveloped under colonial administration and was only beginning the process of reconstruction under newly independent governments. There were roads that became impassable in rainy season. There were regions where cold storage for vaccine was impossible. There were countries that had, in total, a handful of trained epidemiologists. There were places where the health workers needed to carry out a mass vaccination campaign did not exist in the numbers required and could not be trained fast enough to make up the difference. India presented a different set of obstacles. The subcontinent had a vast, highly mobile population. It had pilgrimage routes along which millions of people moved each year, and smallpox moved with them. It had densely packed urban slums where surveillance was nearly impossible, and transmission was nearly guaranteed. It had a public health system that was, by any measure, under-resourced relative to the size of the task. Brazil had its own complications. The Amazon basin was vast and undermapped.
The adaptation came not from the planners in Geneva, but from the field workers who were watching what actually worked and were unsentimental enough to change their approach when the original approach was not working. The strategy that emerged was called ring vaccination. Its logic was different from mass vaccination in a fundamental way. Instead of trying to vaccinate everyone, everywhere, continuously, you targeted your resources precisely and immediately. When a case of smallpox was identified anywhere in the world, a response team moved. They identified every person who had been in contact with that case. They vaccinated every one of those contacts. They identified every person who had been in contact with those contacts. They vaccinated them too. They drew a ring of immune people around the outbreak.
They vaccinated everyone inside the ring before the virus could escape it. The strategy depended on a specific biological feature of smallpox that not every infectious disease shares. Smallpox was not contagious before symptoms appeared. A person infected with smallpox did not become capable of transmitting it until the characteristic rash had erupted on their skin. That rash was unmistakable. It was visible. This meant that by the time you knew someone had smallpox, you could identify who they had been in contact with while contagious. Those contacts had been exposed, but had not yet developed the disease. If you reached them and vaccinated them within a few days of their exposure, the vaccine would often provoke an immune response faster than the disease could progress. The ring held.
The outbreak was contained. The chain of transmission was broken. Ring vaccination required surveillance, not passive surveillance, not waiting for doctors to report cases, but active surveillance. Teams of workers fanning out through villages and markets and clinics, carrying photographs of smallpox cases and asking, "Have you seen anyone with a rash like this?" In some regions, the campaign offered cash rewards for reporting confirmed cases. The rewards were not large by Western standards, but in the communities where the campaign was operating, they were sufficient to motivate the kind of grassroots surveillance network that no official program could have built and maintained at any cost. Ordinary people became the eyes of the eradication campaign.
In village after village, it was not a health worker who identified the case. It was a neighbor, or a market seller, or a school teacher, or a child who had seen the poster and remembered the face on it. The campaign moved through West Africa in the late 1960s. It moved through East Africa, through Ethiopia, through Sudan, through the semi-arid regions of the Sahel. It moved through Bangladesh, which was still part of Pakistan when the campaign began, and had become an independent nation by the time its last cases were being tracked. India was the most difficult and the most important. The subcontinent had, for centuries, been one of the primary reservoirs of the disease.
The Hindu goddess Shaitala Ma was worshipped as the deity of smallpox, propitiated with offerings, appeased with ritual. In some communities, the traditional response to a smallpox outbreak was not isolation, but the holding of festivals, the gathering of relatives who had not yet had the disease, so that they could be infected under divine supervision. The campaign had to navigate not only logistics, but cosmology. By 1973, smallpox had been eliminated from most of the world. It remained in India and in the Horn of Africa. In 1974, an outbreak in the Indian state of Bihar involved more than 11,000 cases. It threatened to reverse years of progress. The WHO mounted an emergency response.
More than 100 international epidemiologists and health workers were deployed to India. Indian health authorities mobilized tens of thousands of local workers. The entire operation was placed under the direction of a Canadian epidemiologist named Lawrence Brilliant, and a small team of intensely committed field workers who were prepared to work without breaks, without weekends, without any of the boundaries that normally separate professional life from personal survival. The Bihar outbreak was brought under control. The cases in India continued to decline. The last case in India was in May 1975. The last case in Bangladesh was in October of the same year. Asia was clear. What remained was the Horn of regions that were remote, that were experiencing political instability, that had health infrastructure of the most minimal kind, and that had been difficult to survey from the beginning. The campaign pursued the last pockets with the same logic it had always used. Find the case, ring the case, vaccinate the contacts, move. On the 26th of October, 1977, in the Somali port town of Merka, a 23-year-old hospital cook named Ali Malin developed the first signs of what would soon be identified as smallpox. He had been in contact with 2 Somali children who had the disease, had driven them in a vehicle for a short distance without realizing what they were suffering from. He had not been vaccinated. His case was identified quickly.
The ring vaccination response was mounted immediately. His contacts were vaccinated. His contacts were vaccinated. The ring held. Ali Malin recovered. No new cases were identified. Surveillance continued for months, then for another year, then for another. Nothing. The disease was gone. Malin did not disappear into history as a footnote. He became a health worker. He spent the following decades vaccinating children against polio in Somalia, working for the CHO and for UNICEF. He died in 2013 from malaria. Having lived long enough to see the near eradication of the disease, he spent his working life fighting. The man who carried the last natural smallpox case in history spent the rest of his life trying to end the next one.
That is the kind of thing that happens sometimes. The person history touches becomes the person history uses. On the 8th of May, 1980, the World Health Assembly formally and officially declared that smallpox had been eradicated. The statement was signed by representatives of every member nation of the World Health Organization. It read, "The world and all its peoples have won freedom from smallpox." Pause on that sentence. The world and all its peoples. Not the wealthy countries, not the countries with functional health systems, not the countries whose governments had cooperated without friction. All of them. Every person alive on the 8th of May, 1980, was safer than every person alive on the 7th.
Because of something that had never happened before in the history of human disease. The total cost of the global eradication campaign across its 13-year intensive phase from 1967 to 1980 was approximately $300 million. At the time of eradication, smallpox was killing between 1.5 and 2 million people every year. Every year since 1980, those deaths have not happened. The $300 million investment has been repaid, in lives many thousands of times over. From Jenner's farm in Berkeley, Gloucestershire, in 1796, to Ali Malin's recovery in Merka, Somalia, in 1977.
179 years.
From the cowpox pustule on Sarah Nelmus's hand to the last natural human smallpox case on Earth. 179 years. 179 years of contestation and resistance, and setback, and reinvention, and political failure, and logistical miracle, and human stubbornness, and human ingenuity in roughly equal measure. Conducted through wars. Conducted through the collapse of empires and the birth of nations. Conducted through a Cold War that might at any point have ended cooperation entirely. Conducted by people who often disagreed with each other, who worked in conditions of considerable hardship, who sometimes did not have enough vaccine, and sometimes did not have enough staff, and sometimes did not know where the cases were. And it worked.
Against the long odds of human organizational failure, against the particular genius of the virus for finding susceptible populations, against the accumulated weight of 3,000 years of smallpox's dominion over human flesh, it worked. The question that stays after the fact of it has been absorbed is not how. The how is documented in extraordinary detail. It is studied in every school of public health in the world. The question that stays is, what does it mean that we only did it once? Smallpox is the only human infectious disease that has ever been eradicated. The only one. Of the hundreds of diseases that have afflicted our species, the only one we have driven to complete extinction by deliberate, coordinated effort is this one.
Polio has been close for 4 decades. Guinea worm disease has been close. Measles has been eliminated from large regions. None have crossed the final line. The conditions that made smallpox eradicable were specific. The virus had no animal reservoir. It could not retreat into wildlife and wait for a future opportunity. It was genetically stable. It did not mutate rapidly enough to escape vaccine-induced immunity. Its symptoms were visible. You could find cases because you could see them. The vaccine was stable, cheap, heat-tolerant after modification, and highly effective. Those conditions coincided in a way that has not coincided again. We found the window. We climbed through it. We have been looking for another window ever since.
The Eradication Declaration of 1980 was not accompanied by a celebration of the kind you might expect. D.A. Henderson returned to his other work. The field teams disbanded. The surveillance networks were taken down. The reward notices came off the walls of the clinics and the market stalls. The people who had done the work went home, or went on to the next problem, or retired, or died. What they left behind was a world in which the disease existed, for the first time in 3,000 years, nowhere in the human body. Only in freezers, only in 2 places on Earth, only behind locks and security protocols and international agreements, and the assumption that the people in charge of those agreements were keeping them.
It took coordinated effort across every continent, through wars and famines and political crises, to finally kill something that had been killing us for 3,000 years.
It took coordinated effort across every continent, through wars and famines and political crises, to finally kill something that had been killing us for 3,000 years. and then it was over. On the 8th of May, 1980, the World Health Organization stood before the assembled delegates in Geneva and made an announcement that had never been made before in the history of medicine and has not been made since. A disease that had stalked every civilization on Earth, that had killed pharaohs and peasants and presidents and children and soldiers and royalty, that had crossed oceans and mountains and the walls of the most fortified cities on Earth, was gone. Not suppressed, not managed, not reduced to a manageable level and monitored indefinitely. Gone. Eradicated.
Pulled out by the roots. For a moment, humanity allowed itself something close to triumph. But triumph has a way of leaving certain questions unresolved. And the question that was left, the one that still sits at the center of a very quiet, very serious argument that has been ongoing for more than 4 decades, is this. What do you do with the last vials? After the declaration of eradication, the decision was made to consolidate all known laboratory stocks of variola major, the technical name for the smallpox virus, into 2 officially sanctioned repositories. Not 1, 2. The first was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia.
Deep inside a biosafety level 4 laboratory, the highest containment classification that exists in biological research. The kind of facility where researchers wear full-body positive pressure suits that are essentially self-contained spacesuits with separate air supplies, so that no particle of what they are studying can make contact with a human body. Where the air that exits the building is filtered and then filtered again. Where every piece of material that leaves the laboratory must pass through an autoclave that destroys biological agents at temperatures high enough to kill anything that has ever been classified as alive. Where the walls and the floors and the ventilation systems are engineered not just to contain organisms, but to contain the very idea of escape.
The second was at the Vector Institute, officially the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology in the city of Koltsovo near Novosibirsk, deep in western Siberia, a facility that had been established during the Soviet period as one of the crown jewels of state biological research, and that continued to operate under Russian government authority after the collapse of the Soviet Union. 2 freezers on opposite sides of the world. 2 countries that had spent the better part of the 20th century pointing nuclear weapons at each other, building walls and propaganda systems and intelligence networks, premised on the assumption that the other side could not be trusted with anything of consequence.
And between them, the last surviving officially acknowledged samples of the only disease that humanity has ever successfully eliminated. The arrangement was not accidental. It was the result of a negotiation that reflected the deep distrust of the Cold War, even as the Cold War was beginning to wind down. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union would agree to allow the other to hold the only remaining samples. Neither would agree to destruction without the ability to verify independently. And so both held the virus under the supervision of the World Health Organization, under an agreement that both parties could point to as evidence of their good faith. A kind of mutually assured preservation, the opposite of mutually assured destruction in some ways.
But not, perhaps, entirely unrelated in its logic. Since that agreement was made, the debate over what to do with those samples has never stopped. The World Health Organization convenes an advisory committee on variola virus research, sometimes shortened to ACAM, though that abbreviation should not be confused with a vaccine that shares similar letters, that meets periodically to evaluate the scientific work being done with the samples and to consider whether those remaining stocks should finally be destroyed. The committee has been meeting for decades. The question has been revisited, reargued, and tabled again and again.
The scientific arguments for keeping the virus are not trivial.
Researchers argue that the live virus is necessary for developing new antivirals, drugs that could treat someone infected with smallpox if the disease were ever to re-emerge. They argue it is necessary for testing vaccines against the actual pathogen, not just surrogate viruses. They argue that as genomic technology advances, the ability to study the virus in its complete form provides information that cannot be replicated by working with fragments or reconstructions. The surrogates for destroying the samples are also not trivial. The virus exists. As long as it exists in physical form, it can escape. Not because the facilities are incompetent, they are not, but because no containment system in history has ever been perfectly maintained forever. Accidents happen. Equipment fails. Human error exists.
And the longer the samples are held, the more opportunities exist for something to go wrong. Beyond accident, there is the question of deliberate theft or misuse, a concern that is not hypothetical, as will become clear in the next chapter. The committee has met. The committee has deliberated. The committee has not reached a consensus that has led to destruction. And so the virus remains. There is a version of this story where the ending is clean, where after the last natural case, after the eradication declaration, the remaining laboratory samples are incinerated in a ceremony that is witnessed, documented, filmed, verified by independent observers from every nation, and then entered into the historical record as the final act of one of humanity's greatest collective achievements.
Where Variola Major passes fully into history, rather than lingering in two frozen rooms in Atlanta and Novosibirsk. That version has not been written yet. We eliminated smallpox from the natural world. We did not eliminate smallpox from a pair of freezers that sit, at this moment, in two cities and two countries that remain geopolitical rivals in ways that would have been familiar to the architects of the Cold War. The question of what that means, whether it represents prudent scientific caution or a failure of will to follow the eradication all the way to its logical conclusion, is one that the relevant institutions have not yet been able to answer. Perhaps they will.
Perhaps the day will come when the last officially sanctioned samples are verified destroyed, and the chapter can be closed. Or perhaps they will remain where they are, in their negative 80 degrees Celsius enclosures, waiting for a decision that keeps not being made.
In 1992, a man named Ken Alibek walked into a debriefing room in the United States and began telling a story that no one in the Western intelligence community had fully wanted to believe, even though some of them had suspected it for years. Alibek, born Kanatyan Alibekov in Kazakhstan in 1950, had spent his career as a scientist and administrator inside the Soviet Union's most secret institution. His official title at the end had been First Deputy Chief of Biopreparat, the Soviet Biological Weapons Program. A program that, as far as the rest of the world was officially informed, did not exist. The Soviet Union had signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, which prohibited the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons.
By signing it, the Soviets had stated clearly and on the record that they were not doing any of those things. They were doing all of those things. According to Alibek's testimony, which he elaborated in his 1999 book Biohazard, BioPreparit employed somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 scientists, engineers, and support staff at peak operation. It ran facilities across more than 40 sites spread throughout the Soviet Union. It worked with anthrax, plague, tularemia, viral hemorrhagic fevers, and other agents that had been stockpiled and weaponized with a level of industrial sophistication that the West had not imagined. And it worked with variola major, not just studying it, not simply preserving samples for defensive research.
Producing it in industrial quantities, in fermenters that could generate hundreds of kilograms of the agent. Developing strains that were resistant to the vaccines that existed at the time. Engineering delivery systems, warheads, aerosol generators, dispersal mechanisms designed to release infectious particles over populated areas. Building an infrastructure capable of deploying smallpox as a weapon against civilian populations on a scale that the disease had never quite achieved even on its own. Alibek described a facility called Zagorsk, now known as Sergia Posad, where this work was concentrated. He described production lines. He described test results.
He described the institutional culture of an organization that had made peace with what it was doing by constructing the familiar logic of deterrence. We are doing this because they might be doing this, and if they do it to us first, we need to be ready. The Western governments that received this information faced a problem that is not unfamiliar in intelligence work. The information was extraordinarily alarming. The source was a defector with potential motivations beyond pure truth-telling. And independent verification was essentially impossible. No satellite image could confirm the contents of a freezer. No signals intercept could describe the strain characteristics of a pathogen. The Soviet and later Russian government denied all of it and continues to deny it.
What the Alibek testimony raised, and what it has never fully resolved, is whether the vector facility in Novosibirsk represents the complete extent of Russian smallpox holdings. Alibek suggested that the program was distributed across multiple sites. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 in a state of bureaucratic and economic chaos that made comprehensive auditing of anything difficult and made auditing of classified biological programs essentially impossible. Scientists dispersed. Facilities were closed, converted, or simply neglected. The chain of custody for materials held inside institutions that had never officially existed was, to put it diplomatically, uncertain. The concern is not purely about Russia.
The same logic applies to any state that might have pursued a clandestine smallpox program during the Cold War, or that might pursue one now. The scientific knowledge required to reconstruct the virus has been advancing. The genomic sequence of variola major has been published in the scientific literature. The question of whether a sophisticated state actor, or a non-state actor with access to the right expertise and equipment, could synthesize or reconstruct a functional poxvirus is one that biosecurity researchers regard with increasingly serious attention. In 2022, monkeypox spread to more than 100 countries in a matter of months. It was renamed Mpox by the World Health Organization in recognition of the stigmatizing associations that the original name had acquired.
Mpox is caused by a different virus, a distinct species within the orthopox virus genus, the same family to which variola belongs. It is less lethal, less efficiently transmitted between humans. Its emergence was not a catastrophe of the scale that smallpox represented at its worst, but it was a demonstration. It was the natural world reminding the global health system that the family of viruses that includes smallpox is not extinct, that the ecological niche that smallpox occupied for 3 millennia does not remain permanently empty simply because one species within that family was eliminated, that the genus has members still circulating in animal populations, rodents and primates in Central and West Africa, from which novel strains can emerge and spread.
The response to the Mpox outbreak also revealed something that biosecurity planners had known, but that the general public had largely forgotten. A significant portion of the global population had never been vaccinated against smallpox. Routine vaccination ended in most countries in the 1970s and early 80s, as the disease was eliminated region by region and the calculus shifted. The risk of the vaccine's side effects began to outweigh the risk of encountering the disease. Anyone born after approximately 1972 in a Western country had no vaccine-derived immunity to orthopox viruses. The United States, which takes its biosecurity obligations seriously in ways that are not always visible, had maintained strategic reserves precisely because of scenarios that classified threat assessments prefer not to discuss in detail.
Approximately 300 million doses of a CAM 2000, a second-generation smallpox vaccine derived from a different poxvirus strain. Approximately 28 million doses of Jynneos, a newer modified Vaccinia Ankara vaccine that produces immunity without the ability to replicate in human cells, making it safer for immunocompromised individuals and also effective against Mpox. 300 million doses. For a disease that has not naturally infected a human being since October 1977. That stockpile does not represent paranoia. It represents an institutional acknowledgement that eradication of a disease from the natural world is not the same as eradication of all risk associated with that disease. The architects of the small...
What came after is a different problem. It belongs to a different set of institutions, and those institutions have decided, on the basis of information that is not entirely public, that 300 million doses of smallpox vaccine should exist and be maintained, continuously, indefinitely. We eradicated the disease. We have been less successful at eradicating the uncertainty that surrounds it.
The word eradication comes from the Latin eradicare, to uproot, to pull out by the roots, so completely that nothing remains in the ground from which new growth could emerge. It is a different word from control. Control means you have limited the damage. It is a different word from elimination. Elimination means you have reduced a disease to 0 cases in a defined geographic region, a country, a continent, but the pathogen still exists somewhere else. Eradication means you have done it everywhere, simultaneously, with no remaining natural reservoir anywhere on Earth, with the virus or bacterium or parasite unable to find a host, unable to replicate, unable to continue.
By that strict definition, by the definition that the people who built the field of epidemiology would recognize as genuine, smallpox is the only human infectious disease that has ever been eradicated. One pathogen, one success, in the entire recorded history of human attempts to control the organisms that kill us. The closest analog in the animal kingdom is rinderpest, a devastating virus that caused catastrophic epidemics in cattle populations across Africa and Asia for centuries. The global rinderpest eradication campaign took decades
and was finally declared complete in 2011. It was a genuine achievement, but rinderpest infected cattle.
The calculus of international cooperation looks different when the disease affects livestock rather than humans. There are fewer religious objections, fewer political complications around bodily autonomy, fewer ideological arguments about the role of states in compelling individuals to participate in public health measures. For human pathogens, the nearest competitor for the title of eradicated is poliomyelitis. The global eradication campaign began in earnest in 1988, 3 years after smallpox eradication was achieved, launched under the leadership of the World Health Organization, Rotary International, UNICEF, and the United States Centers for Disease Control. At the time, polio caused approximately 350,000 cases of paralysis per year across more than 125 countries. The ambition was to replicate what Henderson and his teams had done with smallpox.
More than 30 years later, the campaign has accomplished extraordinary things. Wild poliovirus type 2 was certified eradicated in 2015. Wild poliovirus type 3 was certified eradicated in 2019. The number of cases worldwide has fallen by more than 99%. And yet wild poliovirus type 1 still circulates. It persists in Afghanistan and Pakistan, in regions where decades of conflict and fragmented governance have made it impossible to achieve and sustain the vaccine coverage necessary to break the final chains of transmission. More than 3 decades of effort, more than $20 billion. And the finish line has not been crossed. This comparison is not made to diminish the polio campaign, which has saved millions of children from paralysis.
It is made to illustrate how rare and how contingent the smallpox achievement actually was. Donald Henderson understood this, at least in part, even as he was leading the effort. He began the intensified eradication program in 1967 with a team that was modest by the standards of what would have seemed appropriate for a task of this magnitude. Fewer than 150 international staff members, supplemented by national and local health workers in the countries where the work was being done. A budget that was constrained by the political realities of what member states were willing to contribute, and that required constant negotiation to sustain. The operational context was not favorable.
The campaign ran through the war in Nigeria, through famine conditions in Ethiopia, through the political chaos of Bangladesh in the years following partition. It ran through the suspicions of local populations who had reasons, accumulated over generations, to distrust outsiders who arrived claiming to help. It ran through the indifference of governments that had more immediate crises to manage and did not always see smallpox eradication as a priority. The ring vaccination strategy that Henderson's team developed and refined was itself a response to constraint. The original global plan had called for mass vaccination of entire national populations, an approach that would have required quantities of vaccine and logistical infrastructure that simply did not exist.
The ring approach was developed partly because it worked better in theory, and partly because it was what was actually possible. Ring vaccination means identifying a case, tracing that person's contacts, everyone they had been in proximity to during the infectious period, and vaccinating all of those contacts and the contacts of those contacts before the virus could spread further. It is a strategy that requires surveillance,
more than it requires vaccine supply. It requires information to move fast enough that the immune ring can be built before the virus escapes through a gap. In practice, this meant training local health workers to recognize the characteristic rash. It meant establishing reporting systems in regions where communication infrastructure was minimal.
It meant convincing village leaders and community elders and local health authorities to participate in a program run by an international organization whose agenda they had no particular reason to trust. It meant all of this in dozens of countries simultaneously, across languages and political systems, and social structures and religious traditions that varied enormously. And it worked. The World Health Organization estimated that the total cost of the global smallpox eradication campaign was approximately $300 million, distributed over the 13 years from 1967 to 1980.
The annual savings generated by eradication, from the elimination of vaccination programs, treatment costs, productivity losses from illness and death, were subsequently estimated at somewhere between $1 and $2 billion per year, in every year following eradication, indefinitely. The return on investment is straightforward as arithmetic and nearly impossible to fully comprehend as a human reality. The WHO estimated that without eradication, between 150 million and 200 million people would have died from smallpox in the decades following 1980.
Those numbers represent specific individuals. People who were born, who grew up, who had children of their own, whose grandchildren are alive today. All of whom would not have existed if the campaigns of the 1970s had failed by even a few percentage points. We did this once, not twice, once. And one of the persistent temptations in discussing smallpox eradication is to treat it as a proof of concept, as evidence that if sufficient political will and resources can be assembled, any disease can be eliminated in the same way. The experience of the polio campaign over more than 3 decades suggests that this conclusion does not follow automatically. Each pathogen has its own biology.
Poliovirus can survive in environmental water sources and can spread from asymptomatic individuals, which means surveillance based on visible disease misses a significant fraction of transmission. Measles spreads with such extraordinary efficiency in enclosed spaces that eliminating it requires vaccine coverage sustained above 95% in every community, continuously, without gaps. A threshold that has proved politically and logistically impossible to maintain reliably even in wealthy countries with strong health infrastructure. Smallpox was eradicated when it was, in the way it was, because a particular set of biological characteristics happened to align with a particular moment in history. The virus spread only through direct contact with an infected person or their materials.
It had no animal reservoir. It could not hide in a bat colony or a rodent population and re-emerge from there. It produced a distinctive and highly visible rash that identified infectious individuals quickly and unambiguously. And the existing vaccine, though imperfect, provided reliable protection when administered before exposure and some protection even after. These characteristics made ring vaccination possible in a way that would not work for most other pathogens. They made surveillance effective in a way that surveillance is not for diseases that spread silently. They made the eradication campaign tractable in a way that the polio campaign, despite its longer duration and larger budget, has not yet fully achieved.
The lesson of smallpox is not that eradication is achievable for any disease if you commit to it hard enough and long enough. The lesson is more specific and more humbling than that. The lesson is that this particular disease, with this particular biology, at this particular moment in the history of international health cooperation, was eliminable. And the people who did the work were good enough, and the institutions that supported them held together long enough, and the luck that any complex enterprise requires arrived in sufficient quantity for the thing to be completed. That is what eradication means. Not a formula. A specific achievement. Unrepeated. Potentially unrepeatable by the same means for any other pathogen.
What we did in 1980 deserves to be understood in its full context, not as a template that generalizes, not as a vindication of optimism about what collective human effort can always accomplish, as a singular, specific, unrepeated thing.
His name was Ali Ma'au Ma'lin. He was 23 years old. He worked as a hospital cook in the town of Merka on the southern Somali coast. On the 26th of October 1977, he developed a fever. Within a few days, the rash appeared. The characteristic progression of smallpox, the pustules forming in their distinctive pattern across the face and arms and body, the pattern that had marked the condemned for as long as human beings had been writing things down. He survived. He was the last person on Earth to contract smallpox through natural transmission.
The last link in an unbroken chain of infection that stretched backward through time, through centuries of epidemic and military campaign and ocean crossing and colonial expansion, backward past the bubbling lazarettos of medieval Venice, and the mass graves of Tenochtitlan and the pustulated mummies of the Nile Valley. Backward to wherever, in some animal population in some lost epoch of prehistory, the virus first made the leap into human bodies and discovered that they were hospitable. That chain, which had persisted through every civilization that ever called itself great, ended with one cook in one hospital, in one town on the Somali coast, in the autumn of 1977.
The eradication campaign workers who identified his case did not know immediately that they were looking at the last one. They treated it as they treated all cases, with containment, contact tracing, vaccination of everyone who had been near him. They did the work. The work had become routine enough, by that point, that its historic significance was not fully legible while it was happening. After his recovery, Ali Ma'lin did not step away from the story he had accidentally become part of. He became a health worker himself. He joined the polio vaccination campaigns in Somalia. Campaigns that were, in their own way, attempting to do for polio what Henderson's teams had done for smallpox.
He spent years going door to door in the same region where he had been the last case, asking parents to allow their children to receive the oral vaccine that could protect them from paralysis. He understood something that most people working in public health understand only abstractly, that the difference between a disease that exists and a disease that is gone is measured not in grand declarations, but in individual encounters, repeated thousands of times, in places that are difficult to reach, by people who are not famous and will not be remembered. Ali Ma'lin died in 2013 of malaria while working a vaccination campaign in Merka. He was 59 years old. His obituaries noted the history. They noted the polio work.
They noted that the man who carried the last natural case of the most lethal infectious disease in human history had spent the 36 years between his diagnosis and his death trying to help finish what others had started. There is something in that which resists easy commentary. Consider what smallpox actually was. Not as abstraction, not as statistics arranged in a table, as something that happened to specific people repeatedly, without discrimination, across 3,000 years of recorded history. Ramses the Fifth was Pharaoh of Egypt. He died in approximately 1157 BCE. His mummified remains, examined by modern researchers, carry the unmistakable pitting of smallpox pustules across the face and neck, the oldest physical evidence of the disease that science has been able to confirm.
He was among the most powerful individuals on Earth during his lifetime. He commanded armies and priests and an administrative apparatus that managed the most sophisticated state in the known world. He could not resist a particle invisible to any instrument his court physicians possessed, which had no awareness of his power and no interest in his dynasty. Louis XV was King of France. He died in May of 1774 of smallpox at the age of 63. He had been king for nearly 60 years, the longest reigning monarch in French history at that point. He had access to the best physicians in Europe. He had resources beyond anything that most of his subjects could have imagined. The disease did not make distinctions.
It did not pass over the palace. It came for the king as it came for everyone. The indigenous populations of the Americas encountered smallpox for the first time in the years following European contact. The estimates of what followed vary widely and are inherently uncertain because the populations affected left fewer written records than the populations that brought the disease. But the scholarly consensus places the demographic collapse at somewhere between 50 and 90% of the pre-contact population across the Americas over the course of a century or so, driven by smallpox and measles and other old world pathogens acting together on populations with no prior exposure and therefore no partial immunity.
That range represents the largest proportional demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. It reshaped continents. It emptied cities that had held hundreds of thousands of people. It ended political structures and religious traditions and agricultural systems that had developed over millennia. The land looked empty to the Europeans who arrived in subsequent generations and called it wilderness, not understanding that what they were seeing was the aftermath of a catastrophe, not a natural condition. And then there are the ones who left no records at all.
The peasants and soldiers and enslaved people and children who died in rooms and fields and ships' holds and hospital corridors, whose names were not written down, whose faces were not preserved, who are accessible to history only as increments in a death toll that keeps expanding every time epidemiologists attempt to calculate it. The estimate for the 20th century alone is 300 to 500 million deaths. That range, 200 million wide, reflects genuine uncertainty because the counting was never fully done, because deaths in remote areas and in communities without reliable vital registration are difficult to reconstruct after the fact. The uncertainty is not a minor quibble. 200 million is more than the population of Brazil. 300 to 500 million people.
In 1 century, from one disease, the mind does not naturally accommodate numbers at this scale. It reaches a point where the figures stop producing comprehension and start producing a kind of numbness. The documented psychological phenomenon, sometimes called psychic numbing, in which the individual imagination, which is well equipped to respond to a single identified person's suffering, becomes progressively less responsive as the number of people involved increases. They were not a number. Each of them was a specific person, with a specific fever and a specific delirium, with people who had known them and would miss them. Each of them had a face that was changed by the disease in the days before the outcome became clear.
Each of them was a version of Ali Mao Malin, someone who encountered the virus on a specific day in a specific place, and whose body either found a way through or did not. We cannot give any of them back their individuality. The record is what it is.
What was done by Henderson and his teams, by the local health workers in 31 countries who were trained to recognize the rash and report cases and vaccinate contacts, by the politicians who maintained funding through crises that might have justified cutting it, by the scientists who developed and improved the vaccine, by the community members in Ethiopia and Bangladesh and India and Somalia, who participated in a program run by strangers representing institutions they had no particular reason to trust, was to make it stop.
"3,000 years of living alongside something that had no mercy and no preference and no logic beyond the imperatives of its own replication. And now it lives in 2 refrigerators. In Atlanta, in a building that sits in a complex that most people drive past on the highway without knowing what is inside it. In Novosibirsk, in a facility in a Siberian city that most people in the Western world have never had occasion to think about. In both places, behind security protocols and containment systems and access restrictions that are among the most stringent applied to any material on Earth.
The virus that carved its signature into the face of a pharaoh, that accompanied Cortés across the Atlantic, that moved through the courts of Versailles and the tenements of London and the fortified cities of the Aztec Empire, sits in a vial in a freezer maintained at -80 degrees Celsius, in a building that requires identification, verification, security escort, airlock entry, and positive pressure protective equipment to approach. Whether those vials will be destroyed, whether the committees that have been deliberating for more than 4 decades will eventually reach a consensus that the scientific value of the remaining samples is outweighed by the risk of their continued existence, remains an open question. The arguments on both sides are made by serious people with serious credentials.
The scientific community is genuinely divided. The process continues. What is not in question is this. In the late 1960s, a map covered in red dots existed at the World Health Organization. Every known active outbreak of smallpox on Earth plotted geographically, representing millions of people in active transmission chains, representing thousands of deaths that would accumulate in the coming months if nothing changed. And a man named Donald Henderson looked at that map and said that the dots could be made to disappear. All of them, not through some new technology,
not through some discovery waiting to be made.
Through the systematic, sustained, coordinated work of health teams, deployed across every country where the red dots appeared, doing the same things over and over. Find the case, trace the contacts, build the ring, close the gap. He was right. The dots disappeared, one by one, country by country, continent by continent, until, on a specific day in a specific town in Somalia, one final case developed its fever and its rash, and was identified and contained, and the chain broke. The map went clean. 3,000 years, and then the map went clean.
The disease that outlasted the pharaohs of Egypt, and the legions of Rome, and the armies of Cortés, and the campaigns of Napoleon, that persisted through every political revolution and every technological transformation that human civilization produced in 3 millennia, that killed more people in the 20th century than both world wars combined, that wore the face of inevitability for so long that entire generations of human beings simply understood it as one of the fixed costs of being alive, is gone, not sleeping, not waiting in an animal population somewhere in the forest, not suppressed into latency, waiting for immunity to wane, gone from the world that human beings inhabit. One disease, gone. The rest are still listening.